Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation on the journeys of Paul. We will be discussing who Paul is, where he went, and what he did on his journeys, and the places and people that he interacted with while traveling. Here's a quick little overview of what is going on in this presentation. Paul was an apostle of Jesus. Throughout his lifetime, he went on 3 missionary journeys through Asia Minor and other countries. There is a possible 4th journey that he may have gone on. However, it is not confirmed by historians yet. Within these journeys, Paul was hoping to spread the gospel to the people of the towns that he went through. He was successful in some cities, but beaten and chased out in others. Paul lived from 4 CE, meaning the Common Era, which is sometimes known as 4 AD, meaning Anno Domini, or after Christ, and then he died in 64 CE. There was a lot happening in the world at this time. During this time, Rome was going through the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome. It was a time of plenty, and Rome was flourishing, and was a very large, important city. It was a prospering trade center, and was known far and wide. Augustus, otherwise known as Octavian, was the first emperor of the Roman Empire, which followed the death of Julius Caesar and the decline and end of the Roman Republic. Augustus was loved by the people and brought much peace and prosperity to the empire, and after his death, he was almost like a god in the minds of the Roman citizens, and this started the deification of some Roman emperors that were popular and loved by the people. Augustus handed his reign down to Tiberius, who was a member of the imperial family as well as his stepson. Augustus's 2 grandsons had died previously, so they were unable to take over as emperor. Tiberius handed down his reign to Germanicus. Eventually, Nero became emperor. Nero was the emperor that sort of started the decline of the Roman Empire. He ruled from 54 CE to 68 CE, and his reign quickly drained the Roman treasury of most of its financial resources. He eventually committed suicide, which ended his reign. He is also attributed with the execution of St. Paul the Apostle. Life in the Roman Empire. Life during this time period was quite different from today. It was a patriarchal society, meaning that the father was sort of the ruler of the household and the family. The wealthier families had slaves and servants and spent quite a bit of money showing off all of what they had. They built lavish homes and courtyards and showed off their wealth through the use of beautiful Roman architecture like arches and pillars. The father controlled the family, and the woman had less power and value during this time. The patriarch decided which children lived. If he decided that a child was not good enough, or they had too many children, or anything like that, the father would expose the child, meaning the baby would die typically from exposure to the elements. The patriarch could also divorce his wife or kill her if she committed adultery. The woman was the caretaker of the household and would run it. She owed complete loyalty and obedience to her husband. The typical modes of transportation during this time were mainly just walking, or taking a boat if there was a river or sea, or riding a horse or donkey. The Roman military used chariots with horses pulling them, and people that were traveling with things used carts to transport their possessions. There were a couple of different forms of execution during this time period. Paul was killed by decapitation, but there was also crucifixion. Jesus was crucified around 33 CE. Crucifixion is death on a cross. The criminal has to carry the cross through the town and bring it to the hill or area where he or she will be crucified. The cross is set up and the person is hung with arms outstretched and nailed to the cross, and the feet are together with a nail through them. The person hangs there until they die. Typically, the criminal only lasts a day, but some last longer if they push themselves up on their feet so they are able to breathe. Eventually, if the criminal is living too long on the cross, the guards would break the legs so they could not support the weight of the body, and the body would be hung completely from the arms. The person could not breathe in this position and would die. Jesus was crucified in this manner, although he had a crown of thorns on his head as well, to mock him and his belief that he was the Son of God. Jesus. There was great controversy during this time period of whether or not to believe in Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. But many people were converted to Christianity back then because they decided to believe in Jesus. That is a big difference between Judaism and Christianity. Christians believe that Jesus, or the Son of God, has already come and died and was raised to life again. Jews believe that the Messiah has not yet come, and that Jesus was a blasphemous heretic. Jesus preached in cities similarly to Paul, and was eventually arrested and then crucified. Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, and that he ascended into heaven after that. Jesus was central to the Christian movement. Paul, whose original name was Saul, was born in the city of Tarsus around 4 CE. During this time, Tarsus was a major city in eastern Cilicia. By the time that Paul became an adult, Tarsus was adopted into the Roman province of Syria. Two cities in Syria, Damascus and Antioch, played major roles in Paul's later years. As a child, Paul spoke Greek and grew up as a Jew. He learned the trade of tent making, which was his occupation and hobby nearly his whole life. Knowing this trade allowed him to be on the move and traveling during his missionary journeys, since he could set up camp anywhere and did not need extensive accommodations. He was a member of the Pharisees for about half of his life. The Pharisees were Jewish religious elites who radically followed the law and were well respected and looked up to in the Jewish community. They held their traditions that were not from the Bible as equally important with the Bible, and believed in heaven and hell. Most of the Pharisees memorized the whole entire Bible, and Paul was no exception. He was able to quote nearly anything from the Bible from memory, which was handy while traveling, so he did not always need to have the Bible on hand. As the Christian movement erupted around him and Jesus became more known, Paul began to hate this movement and the leader. He was well known in the Christian community to be a significant persecutor and would arrest or stone Christians whenever he had the chance. It is not truly known why he hated the Christians so severely, but it was potentially just because the high priest was against the Christian movement as well, and as a Pharisee, Paul wanted to follow the leader of his group. Paul also did not believe that Jesus was the actual Son of God, and instead believed him to be a heretic, and therefore the whole Christian movement was heresy. He traveled around synagogues and searched out any Jews that accepted Jesus as the Son of God and persecuted them. Paul was coming from Antioch and traveling to Damascus. On the way, he said that he had a sort of vision. Within this vision, he was said to have seen the Lord and was convinced that Jesus was the true Messiah. In some versions of this, he was said to have been blinded by a bright light. He promptly converted to Christianity around 33 CE, and in Damascus, he sought out a well-known Christian named Ananias and talked with him. In the biblical version of this, Paul had been blinded, and Ananias used power from the Lord to remove the scales from his eyes. However, according to historians, he just sought out Ananias to speak with him about Christianity and what to do next. Because he was so well known for persecuting Christians, many people in the Christian community did not want to accept him and did not believe that he had truly converted. 3 years after this, he went to Jerusalem to start to become acquainted with the well-known apostles of the Christian faith. Quickly after this meeting, he started his missionary journeys in Asia Minor and surrounding areas. He quickly became well known, and his previous reputation as a persecutor diminished in the light of his fervor for the Lord and for spreading the gospel. He planted several churches throughout his lifetime, and eventually became a writer. He for sure wrote 7 books of the Bible, and is written about in many more. He wrote the books of Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. And he also potentially wrote another 6 as well, although these may have been written by his followers based on his letters. His reputation as an apostle of Jesus, although not one of the 12 that traveled with Jesus, flourished, and he was a major influence in the areas he traveled in and an inspiration to other Christians. During his years as a follower of Jesus, he had a couple of different squabbles with other Jewish Christians. He believed in preaching to everyone, but focused more on the Gentiles, meaning the non-Jewish. Because of his love for the Gentiles, he did not believe that they had to become Jewish in order to become a Christian. This meant that he did not preach that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised or any of the other steps to becoming a Jew. He and the other Jewish Christians finally decided that Paul would be the primary apostle that spoke to the Gentiles, as long as he also started a collection for the Church of Jerusalem. Later, he returned to Jerusalem to give the money to the church that he had collected for them. He brought with him a couple of Gentiles that had converted to Christianity. In Jerusalem, he was arrested because he brought one of these Gentiles too far into the temple. He went through several trials and was then sent to Rome to be put in prison. He was potentially kept there until his death by execution. Popular belief by historians leans toward that Nero ordered his execution following the Great Fire in Rome in 64 CE. Missionary Journey 1. Paul was in Syria in the city of Antioch with Barnabas, another Christian. While there, the Church of Antioch, and they would also say the Holy Spirit, commissioned these two to go on a missionary journey to spread the gospel of Christ and share the good news of Jesus. Paul and Barnabas set off on this first missionary journey in 46 CE, and John Mark tagged along with them for a while. This first journey takes the three of them all the way from Syrian Antioch through Asia Minor and back in a huge loop around the surrounding areas. The two of them set sail from Seleucia and go all the way to Cyprus. In Cyprus, they preach in the synagogues in the port city of Salamis. This city was also the hometown of Barnabas, so they were fairly comfortable here. Eventually, the three men walk across Cyprus, which is about 90 miles, to get to Paphos, which is actually the capital of Cyprus. This was a very important port city of the Roman Empire and still has a number of splendid attractions for tourists and locals to see and tour. From Paphos, they sail to Perga, which is on the coast of Pamphylia. Perga is the capital city of Pamphylia. After landing here, John Mark decides to leave because he does not know the Greek and is not comfortable with Greek-speaking Jews. So Barnabas and Paul head to Antioch in Pisidia and preach in the city for some time. They eventually make their way over to Iconium and stay there for a couple of months. Then they head to Lystra in Lycaonia. After a violent encounter with some of the people from previous towns they had visited, Paul and Barnabas went to Derbe. After preaching here, they make their way back through all of the previous cities to strengthen any of the new believers, and they eventually end up back in Antioch in Syria in 48 CE. They were gone a total of 2 years on this journey. New believers. Paul and Barnabas preached a little bit in the synagogues in Salamis, but this city was not their main focus. As they traveled to Paphos, they had to walk through many cities. They took advantage of these opportunities and preached in synagogues as they traveled. In Paphos, they had quite an encounter with Elymas, who was an advocate for the devil and was called a magician. Paul reprimanded this man, and in the Bible, he performed a miracle and temporarily blinded him. However, this is not confirmed by historians. The proconsul of Paphos witnessed this encounter of Paul with Elymas and was converted and believed that Jesus was the Son of God. Perga was pagan, and there were many different temples to different Greek gods. This was the introduction of more Greek and pagan cities, which is when John Mark left. In Antioch and Pisidia, Paul is able to preach in the synagogue on the Sabbath. His message was so profound and so well delivered that on the next Sabbath, nearly the whole synagogue was full of people wanting to hear what Paul had to say, not necessarily because they liked it, but because he delivered it so well. This is the city that is a major point of Paul's career. It is when he turns his preaching and attention to the Gentiles. The Jews in the city had treated him horribly and did not receive him well, so he decided to go to the outskirts and preach to the Gentiles. This goes well up until the Jews in Antioch kick him out of the city. Barnabas and Paul stay in Iconium for a couple of months, preaching to Jews and Gentiles alike. However, the Jews who are rejecting the news about Jesus start to form a plot to stone Paul for blasphemy. When Barnabas and Paul discover this plan, they flee the city and try to hide in Lystra. In Lystra, the two men are accredited with a miracle healing, and the people think that they are the sons of gods and try to honor them. The men protest and try to explain that they are only human and that God is the one who should be honored, but the people did not listen. Then, Jews from previous cities like Iconium arrived in Lystra and convinced the crowds that Paul was blasphemous and should be stoned. Paul is stoned and dragged outside the city to be left for the dead. But some of the other apostles and the new followers in Lystra help him come back to health, and Paul and Barnabas set off for Derbe. Derbe, their last stop, receives the news of Jesus quite well, and a great number of people start to believe. On their way back, as the two men stopped at each of the towns that they had been in previously, they tried to strengthen the new believers in each city and helped to appoint elders for the new churches in each as well. Then the two Christians set off to go back to Antioch. Cyprus. Paul traveled through many important and influential cities during his first missionary journey with Barnabas. The first city that they traveled to was Salamis, a port city in Cyprus. This city had a booming sea trade business and had a large Jewish community. This was the hometown of Barnabas, so he was quite familiar with this area when he and Paul came through. Paul's work as a tent maker may have been seen in this area. Because of the large marketplace, or agora, in this city, it is a very big possibility that Paul may have set up a stand and talked about Christianity with fellow people in the marketplace, while also providing his services for others. Today, Salamis is a great place for tourists because there are many surviving relics of the Roman Empire time period, like Roman baths and gymnasiums, as well as the tomb of St. Barnabas, the travel companion of Paul. There is also a theater, a surviving temple of Zeus, and many other ruins that people are able to visit and take a tour of and learn about. The next city was Paphos, the capital of Cyprus. It was also a large port city and was believed to be the home of the goddess Athena. The proconsul, the group of people that collected taxes and did a couple of other things for the Roman government, also resided in Paphos. Paphos also has ruins to visit and famous landmarks that are well known today. A Roman marketplace was reconstructed, and a temple of Apollo and the rock of Athena are also in Paphos that many tourists visit. Perga was the next city visited, or passed through, at least. It is the capital of Pamphylia and is located along the river Cestrus, inland a bit. This was a prime location because it provided a safe harbor as well as good shelter from harsh sea storms, but was also near enough to the sea that it attracted many visitors and had incoming trade and business from the Mediterranean. This was still part of the Roman Empire during this time, and this city had many Greek pagan temples for many different gods like Artemis and the goddess of luck. In this city, there are many relics still standing as well. There is still a functioning amphitheater, as well as the ruins of previously grand temples and the Hellenistic Gate. The next city is Antioch in Pisidia, which was a major military base for the Roman Empire. There were better roads leading in and out of it, so any troops from the city could quickly travel anywhere that they needed to go. The city was named after King Antiochus I, and the Syrian Antioch was named after him as well. This is a well-traveled city for tourists today as well. It has ruins of a great bathhouse, a large aqueduct, and a grand Byzantine church that may have been dedicated to St. Paul. Iconium, in Turkey, was the next stop, and this city was a grand and important city in the 1st century CE. It was founded by the Hittites and was a Roman military base in the 1st century. There is even a Byzantine church found here that was dedicated to St. Paul and his visits to Iconium. The cities Lystra and Derbe were the last 2 cities that Barnabas and Paul stopped in before heading back to Antioch in Syria. Lystra was more out in the middle of nowhere and less important than the other cities that Paul had been traveling to. He came here to run from a plot to kill him, so this location was perfect for that. This town is on a fertile plain and was a military staging post built near the Via Sebaste, an imperial road that many military towns laid on. It was kept up well so that any troops that needed this road could travel more quickly and not have as many risks. There was more of an assurance of arrival to the intended destination than there would have been without this road. Lystra was pagan and had many Greek temples for the gods built within the city. They even had the temples of Zeus. Timothy was a new believer that came from Lystra, and he became quite well known later on. Today, this city is nearly non-existent except for a few leftover crumbling stones. Derbe was not a very important city. Its name means Jupiter, and in this city, quite a few people came to believe in Jesus because of Paul and his teaching. Today, just like Lystra, Derbe is almost non-existent with just a few crumbling stones left behind. Missionary Journey 2. In 50 CE, Paul decides that he would like to return to the cities that he had visited on his previous journey and check up on the people in each of the churches that he had established. He discussed the idea with Barnabas, and initially, Barnabas was very excited about the journey. They had established some amazing relationships with the people in these cities, and the opportunity to see some friends in these cities, as well as encourage the newer believers in Jesus, was a tempting prospect. But then, Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement. On the previous journey, John Mark had come along only through Cyprus and then left because he did not feel comfortable going into more of the Greek lands. Paul was upset with him about this, and he did not want to take John Mark with them again. Barnabas thought that they should take John Mark with them, so Paul and Barnabas fought. They also had some differing views on Gentiles and Jews and the mixing of the two. Paul had more of a heart for the Gentiles and did not think that they had to get circumcised to become a Christian. He also thought that Jews and Gentiles could eat together, but Barnabas disagreed. He believed that Gentiles should be circumcised and that Jews and Gentiles should not eat together. So Barnabas and Paul decide that they will split up and take new companions with them. Barnabas goes and revisits the planted churches in Cyprus, who were all mainly Jewish Christians. He takes his nephew, John Mark, and takes his journey separate from Paul. Paul visits the Greek churches that he had planted in Asia Minor and Galatia and Pisidia. He decided to take Silas with him, who is from the Jerusalem community of Christians. Silas and Paul go and visit the churches in the Greek-speaking and more pagan areas. Revisiting the churches. Paul and Silas are staying on land instead of traveling to Cyprus through sea like last time. So first they travel through Syria and Cilicia and encourage the believers that are in these areas. Then they pass through Derbe and then Lystra. In Lystra, Paul reconnects with Timothy and wants him to accompany him on the rest of his journey. So the 3 of them set off again and travel through Galatia and Phrygia, 2 Roman provinces. Then they travel through Mysia and to Troas on the coast of the Aegean Sea. During the night, Paul says that he had a vision that encouraged him to go and preach the gospel to the lost people of Macedonia. So he takes Luke, Timothy, and Silas, and they all sail to the island of Samothrace, and then straight to Neapolis. After arriving in Neapolis, the 4 men head straight for Philippi, taking the Via Egnatia route. They stay in Philippi for quite some time, and in that time, Paul and Silas are wrongfully imprisoned for a short period. Paul and Silas leave their companions in Philippi and start their travels along the Via Egnatia again. They travel through Amphipolis and Apollonia and eventually reach Thessalonica, where they stay for several weeks. The Jews in the city become angered with them after a while, and Paul and Silas are forced to escape in the middle of the night so as not to be noticed. The two men move on to Berea to preach in the synagogues there. A large number of Jews believe, but the men are forced to leave once again because unhappy people from the other cities came to bring trouble for Paul and Silas and Timothy. Paul leaves Timothy and Silas in Berea and continues on alone towards Athens and Achaia. There he preached and talked with philosophers. He pointed out the foolishness of an unknown God, which there had been an altar for. Many ended up turning and believing in Jesus and the gospel of Christ. From there, he moves on and establishes a church in Corinth, where he is eventually joined by Silas and Timothy again. He stays in Athens for over a year and practices his trade as a tent maker while also preaching about Jesus. He eventually sails to Ephesus with his two new companions, leaves his companions there, and sails back to Caesarea and goes to Jerusalem. He reports all of his travel to the church there and then returns to Antioch in Syria. Thus ends his second missionary trip in 52 CE. Teachings. When Paul and Silas are in Lystra, Paul wants Timothy, a believer that had converted last time Paul was there, to come with him on the rest of his missionary journey. Timothy accepts, but there is a problem. In order for Timothy to actually come and preach in the synagogues, as well as come into the temple, he needed to be circumcised. So, because Timothy was already born a Jew, but had not been circumcised because he was Greek, Paul circumcised him so that he would be able to come. They skip over Asia because they believed that the Holy Spirit was guiding them another way and telling them not to preach in Asia at all. When Paul and his companions eventually reached Philippi, they realized that there are very few Jews to be able to preach to, and there is no synagogue in the town. So the four men travel to the outskirts of the town and speak to the women. One in particular, Lydia from Thyatira, accepted their message about Jesus quickly. She was a rich woman, most likely a widow, and was in the industry of dyeing purple cloth, which was very expensive back then and for the kings. She and her whole family believed in the message of Jesus, and they were all baptized. She then offers up her home for Paul and his companions to use. Paul, Luke, Timothy, and Silas use this house as their sort of base while they stay and preach in Philippi. They would all go over to the marketplace every day, and there was one girl that would constantly bother Paul and talk to him and try to read his fortunes. He became very annoyed with this girl that was constantly interrupting and bothering him, so he spoke to her and is said to have cast out an evil spirit from her. This made the owners of the slave girl very angry because she was unable to fortune tell anymore and could not make money for them. Paul and Silas were accused of these crimes, and therefore before they could even get a trial in, they were flogged and thrown into prison. The crowd had gone wild and caused this injustice to happen. That night, there was a strong earthquake, and it set the two men free from their cells. The jailer believed that this was a sign that God and Jesus were real, so he became a Christian along with his whole household, and they were baptized that day. The magistrates were forced to realize that Paul and Silas had done nothing wrong and had to apologize for not giving them a fair trial and for flogging and imprisoning them with no cause. Eventually, the four companions traveled to Thessalonica and preached in the Jewish synagogues for 3 Sabbaths in a row. However, the Jews in the city became quite angry with them, and the companions were forced to escape once again under the cover of darkness. Paul, Silas, and Timothy traveled to Berea. Many people received the message well and believe, but Paul is forced to leave quite quickly because some Thessalonians arrived to cause trouble for him. He travels alone to Athens, where many Greek gods and goddesses were worshipped and revered. He speaks with philosophers in the marketplace and is able to convert some people through speaking about the purpose of the unknown God they had an altar for, and how pointless that was for them. He shared his message about Jesus with them, and many believed, including Dionysius, who was a prominent figure. He then moves on to Corinth, where he stays for over a year. He stays with Aquila and Priscilla, 2 Jews in the city. All 3 of them are tent makers, so they establish a temporary business in the marketplace while also sharing the gospel of Christ and the news of Jesus. He eventually moves on and makes his way back to Jerusalem, first through Ephesus and then to Caesarea and then to Jerusalem. He reports all that he has done to the Jewish elders in Jerusalem and then heads back to Antioch in Syria. Paul and Silas started off by traveling through Galatia and into Troas. Troas is a very well-known city. It was founded by Antigonus, a commander during the time of Alexander the Great. It was filled with retired warriors who had fought in wars but were settling down with their families in this wonderful city. There was also the fact that it was so near to the city of Troy from Homer's The Iliad. There are many ruins left in the city today as well. There are baths, theaters, temples, and more, all packed into one city. Neapolis was a port city founded in the 6th century BCE. It was brought into the Roman Empire and brought people from all around to see Philippi during Paul's time. When Paul stepped into the city, it was the first time he had ever set foot in Europe. It is documented on a mosaic showing him stepping off of the boat. This mosaic is in a church near the port. Philippi is a classical Greek city. After it was conquered, it turned into a Roman city, and many retired soldiers and families lived in the city as well. It was also rich with gold, so there was a mining industry in Philippi. Thessalonica was another stop of Paul's journey. This was another famous city, and it lay on the Via Egnatia, a road that ran the length of most of this area. Thessalonica was founded by King Cassandros in 315 BCE and was the capital of Macedonia during the time of Paul. Berea was a larger city. It was fairly well developed by the time Paul came around, and there was quite a large group of Jews living there. There are a couple of different famous places in Berea today, like the Church of Anastasis. Athens was next, and is the capital of Greece. This was the birthplace of thinking and philosophy and things like that. Today, this city still attracts thousands of tourists wanting to see the landmarks and old buildings. The Parthenon is in Athens, as well as several churches and temples and altars. Corinth was mostly a trading city. It had 2 harbors during the time of Paul. This city was destroyed and then rebuilt during the Roman Republic, and one of the few things left as the original during the rebuilding was the Temple of Apollo. Paul went to a great many places and told the gospel to a great many of people in his second missionary journey. Missionary Journey 3. Paul and Timothy set out in 53 CE after only a couple of months of being back home. They wished to journey back to the newer believers in Galatia and Phrygia. Paul goes through all of the cities that he has previously traveled. He goes to Ephesus for quite a bit of time, around 3 years, and stays with Priscilla and Aquila. Paul quickly visits a couple of other places, specifically Macedonia and Achaia. He sails from Troas to Macedonia, and he has a couple of different confrontations with people. After Macedonia, he goes to Corinth to encourage the believers there. He stayed there for the winter of 56 CE, about 3 months. He then returns on land back to Macedonia and goes to Philippi and stays for the Passover festival. Then he travels back to Neapolis and then to Troas for a week-long stay. He then starts to journey to Assos on foot, even though the rest of his companions are taking a ship to Assos. They all meet up in Assos and sail to Mytilene, then to Chios, then Samos, all the way to Miletus. He then makes his way to Kos, then Patara, and then heads toward the Ptolemies. He then goes to Caesarea and returns to Jerusalem, where he pays the offering he has collected for the poorer churches in Jerusalem. Thus ends his third journey, around 57 CE. Paul and Timothy revisited quite a few of the previously established churches. They took a very similar route to their second journey this time around. Apollos went ahead of them to Ephesus to speak to the people there about baptism in the Holy Spirit, because they only knew about baptism in water like John had done for Jesus. So Paul sent Apollos ahead, and he and Timothy slowly made their way across the countryside. When Paul arrived in Ephesus, he realized that Apollos had made a mistake and again only taught about John's baptism and not the baptism of the Holy Spirit. So Paul had to teach these people about the Holy Spirit, and he prayed with the church there, asking for power from the Holy Spirit. Paul and Timothy stayed for 3 years in Ephesus, staying with Priscilla and Aquila. They taught in the synagogues for a while, but Jews started to complain, so they had to move to the lecture hall of Tyrannus. As he preached in Ephesus, many turned and believed in Jesus. Magicians were destroying their magic books and were wanting to follow Jesus instead. Paul realized that he still needed to collect money for the churches in Jerusalem, so he made a trip to Macedonia and Achaia and collected offerings. There was a crazy encounter with the silversmith in Ephesus. Demetrius was making images on coins of the fertility goddess, Artemis, for people that came to visit the temple of Artemis. Paul speaks against this, and Demetrius suffers. He makes a big fuss and starts almost a riot. Paul and his friends were dragged in front, but eventually the magistrates shut the riot down and said they had to bring it to the court to make it mean anything. Paul then sails to Macedonia to meet Timothy and Erastus there. He encourages the believers there, then goes to Corinth to stay for the winter. After winter was done, he was planning to sail right back to Jerusalem and bring the offering he had collected for the church in Jerusalem. But he caught wind of a plot to kill him on the way back, so he changed his route. He goes back to Macedonia once again, but over land, and goes to Philippi for the Passover festival. He eventually ends up in Troas for a week. During this time, he wanted to preach as much as he could because he did not have much time with the church there. So he spoke day and night. One night, a boy fell out of the window because he fell asleep and was so entranced with Paul's words. He finally returned to Jerusalem by sailing from city to city along the coast. Once he arrived, he immediately brought the offering he had collected to the church, because there was talk of his arrest coming in Jerusalem, and he wanted to make sure that he had brought the money to Jerusalem and the church there. Ephesus was a very important city for the Roman Empire, and is still an influential city even today. Ephesus was in Asia, and was mostly pagan. There were lots of temples for the gods and goddesses, and one of the largest and most grand temples was the Temple of Artemis, which caused problems with Paul and a silversmith. This temple was actually considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Today, people are allowed to tour the magnificent ruins of this temple. Artemis was the fertility goddess. If she looked upon you with favor, this supposedly allowed you to have more children, or allowed your crops to have more babies. In Ephesus, anyone can tour Byzantine churches from the 4th century, like the one known as Hagia Maria, which is named after the Virgin Mary. The Library of Celsus is also able to be seen today, although it was not around in Paul's time. There is also the Temple of Hadrian and the Fountain of Trajan. The tomb of St. Luke is also thought to be in Ephesus. Assos was a Greek city. It was known to be the home of Aristotle, a famous philosopher. Today, if you choose to visit Assos in Turkey, you are actually able to sail right up into the old port and walk among the old ruins of the city. The Roman Agora and theater and gymnasium are still around to see the ruins of today. Miletus was another prominent city during the life of Paul that he visited. It was a port, had many different pagan temples, and had a large marketplace. Visitors today are still able to walk through the remains of the city. You are able to walk where Paul would have walked during his stay in the city. Ptolemy's was another port that Paul traveled through, but on the coast of Palestine. It was an Egyptian settlement named after the pharaoh Ptolemy II. The Romans kept the name once they conquered the city. Today, it's a beautiful city. People are allowed to see the Crusader citadel and other important remnants of the past. They are able to arrive where Paul would have arrived and see the story that history there is telling us. Caesarea is a large port city that was built by Herod the Great around the 20s BCE. Today, there's actually a national park there called Caesarea National Park. Within this park, there are viewings and tours of an amphitheater and a port. Paul's fourth missionary journey does not have a specific timeline to it, as it is not even concrete that he was actually able to complete this journey in the first place. But if the fourth journey is real, Paul most likely went to Spain to spread the gospel and the good news of Jesus there. Although other people count his fourth journey as the time that he went from Caesarea to Rome because he spread the gospel along the way. Paul had it very rough when he got back from his third missionary trip. Quickly after he arrived in Jerusalem, he went to the synagogues to teach like he always did. But once he got there, the Jews were very upset and started a violent riot. Paul was arrested so that he could be safely carried away from the violent, crazy crowds. While he was in prison, there was a plot to take his life again. He discovered this sinister plot, told the commander, and was transferred to a prison in Caesarea for 2 years, from 58 CE to 60 CE. There were a couple of struggles and pushes to let him out of prison, but he finally appealed himself to Caesar and asked to be allowed to go to Rome. He was allowed to be transferred to Rome, but along the way, his boat was shipwrecked in 59 CE. The storm lasted for a while, and the ship that Paul was being transferred in was getting beaten and battered by the raging sea. It was slowly sinking. Eventually, they spotted the landmass in the middle of the night. They put their anchors down and tried to last the night until the morning so they could see where they were and where to steer the ship to. They eventually all made it to the shore after the boat hit a large sandbar and got ripped apart by the sea. The beach that everyone ended up swimming to is called St. Paul's Bay. It's on the island of Malta. The crew and Paul stay on the island for 3 months during the winter, and in the spring they are able to set off again to complete their journey to Rome. They were able to secure a new ship and anchor at a couple of different spots until the final destination. Then Paul had house arrest in Rome, and in 60 CE he reached Rome after walking there from the nearest port. He was under house arrest for 2 years and most likely had the freedom to preach the gospel and walk around the city. During this time, he had a couple of different companions that stayed with him in the city. Luke, Timothy, Epaphras, John Mark, and Demas were all in the city with him, and they all walked around and preached the gospel to the people of the city. His supposed fourth journey to Spain would have happened after Paul's house arrest, if it did occur. During all of his journeys, Paul was an author. Throughout all of his trials, Paul wrote letters and books. He was always encouraging the churches that he had helped establish. He wrote the books of Galatians to help encourage and keep the church in Galatia that he had started on the right track. He did the same for Corinthians to the church in Corinth, and Ephesians was to the church in Ephesus. Paul loved to write and he loved to help others and serve others. When he was in prison, he wrote 4 major letters to 4 different churches. These 4 letters are commonly known as the prison epistles. He wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon in prison, to the churches of Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, and then also to a wealthy Christian named Philemon who lived in Colossae. He wrote Romans during one of his journeys and wrote the Thessalonians during his second missionary journey. He was non-stop preaching and writing and encouraging to churches around the world. Overall, Paul was an apostle of Jesus and lived half of his life serving the Lord to the best of his ability and encouraging others and planting new churches in the world that believed in Jesus as the Messiah and as the Son of God. He grew up persecuting Christians, but ended up becoming one. He went on 3 missionary journeys throughout his lifetime, was imprisoned and beaten multiple times, and lived through a shipwreck. Paul was a remarkable man, and his journeys impacted Christianity and the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire as well. Most of my sources are scholarly articles and journals from the resource database JSTOR. I also looked and used the Britannica Encyclopedia.